Well, so far, we have gone through the first two chapters of Habakkuk and seen his two discourses with God. His complaint about how long, O Lord, are you going to put up with all this evil and injustice? And why are you so silent? Why do you make me see these things? And then, how can you possibly, being a God of justice, raise up an even less righteous people than us to destroy us? Well, God has given a comprehensive answer, and it's gone far beyond Judah and Babylon. Now we come to the concluding chapter, chapter 3, which is titled as A Prayer of Habakkuk. In this chapter, as I mentioned at the beginning, while it's called a prayer, it really is packaged and presented to the people as a psalm to be used in public worship. And we see that both from the beginning in verse 1, where it says that it is a prayer according to Shigionoth, which has been described, as I mentioned in the introduction, as a musical term that relates to how a psalm should be performed. And then in the last verse, he talks about, at the very last line, is to the choir master with stringed instruments. So again, while it's titled a prayer, it appears to be really a psalm set to music to be used in public worship. Now, structurally, chapter 3 is linked sometimes by contrast with chapter 1 and the rest of the book. And so chapter 3 can be regarded as an expression of faith for which the beginning of chapter 2, the righteous shall live by faith, chapter 2, verse 4, has led the way. And so in chapter 3, it provides the development and the resolution of the struggles expressed by Habakkuk, his struggles with coming to grips with God. How can you do this and still be just? The resolution of these struggles that he had expressed in chapters 1 and 2. Now, I would point out also in chapter 1, where it says a prayer of Habakkuk, the prophet according to Shigionoth, the word prayer, tepillah, is a typical title for psalms of lament, which petition God for deliverance. That word is used, for example, in Psalms 17, 86, 90, 102, and 142 at the beginning of those psalms. Now, in verse 2, this is his invocation. He says, O Lord, I have heard the report of you, and your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. Now, what he's doing is he is looking back to God's deeds in the past as his basis for appealing to God's help in the present and in the future, particularly when the invasion from Babylon comes. Now, as we will see, the deeds that he's looking back to, primarily the imagery of those deeds, relates to the events surrounding the Exodus out of Egypt and God on Mount Sinai. And when he says, in the midst of the years, revive it, revive your work, in the midst of the years probably refers to now, in this present time. Revive your work again. Or in our own time. So he ends this invocation by saying, in wrath, remember mercy. That's kind of the counterpart to the way he ended chapter 1, verse 17, his second complaint to God, when he said, is he, referring to Babylon, then going to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? Well, so because he knew that Babylon was a merciless nation, and he was afraid this is just going to continue forever. So, Lord, in your wrath, in your judgment, remember mercy. Now that leads us to the bulk of chapter 3, verses 3 through 15. These verses focus on God's power, his wrath, and his magnificent and fearsome deeds. Then chapter 3 ends in verses 16 through 19 with Habakkuk recognizing his own smallness in relation to the greatness of God, and yet at the same time rejoicing in God, who is his strength. So first let's take a look at verses 3 through 15, which say, God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran, Selah. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. Was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers, or your indignation against the sea, when you rode on your horses on your chariot of salvation? You stripped the sheath from your bow, calling for many arrows, Selah. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. The raging waters swept on. The deep gave forth its voice. It lifted its hands on high. The sun and moon stood still in their place at the light of your arrows as they sped, at the flash of your glittering spear. You marched through the earth in fury. You threshed the nations in anger. You went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck, Selah. You pierced with his own arrows the heads of his warriors, who came like a whirlwind to scatter me, rejoicing as if to devour the poor in spirit. You trampled the sea with your horses, the surging of mighty waters. Now, note that the word Selah is used 3 times. The only other place in the Bible where that word is used is in the Psalms. And the term Selah is found 71 times in 39 of the Psalms. And most scholars believe either that it was a musical notation, meaning silence or pause, something like that. Some think it was similar to a musical interlude. But again, that suggests that chapter 3 is essentially, although styled a prayer, a psalm used during public worship. And in fact, Habakkuk chapter 3 was read during the Feast of Weeks, when the giving of the Torah was celebrated. Now, let's take a look at, have an overview of this section, verses 3 through 15. This section describes what is known as a theophany, which is a manifestation or appearance of God in the world to people. And this theophany likely occurred to Habakkuk in a vision, which is why some scholars, when they, back in chapter 2, when he was told, wait for the vision, some scholars say that the vision extended all the way through not only chapter 2, but also chapter 3. Now, theophanies, as described in the Bible, often involve awesome displays of God's power and magnificence, such as thunder and lightning and fire and smoke and clouds and earthquakes. And we see that, for example, in Exodus 19, when on Mount Sinai, all of these kind of things occurred. Now, the language that Habakkuk uses in this section, particularly verses 6, 9, 10, 11, and 15, which talk about He shook the nations. The mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills were low. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. The raging waters swept on, and so on. The sun and the moon stood still in their place. And you trampled the sea with your horses. That kind of language is figurative language that frequently was used by the prophets to describe political crises and regime changes, including events involving Judah and Babylon. So political changes, crises, regime changes were often metaphorically described in the prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, Zephaniah, and others as involving cosmic upheavals or the overthrowing of creation itself. We need to understand this is metaphorical language. But this same type of language is used with the greatest theophany of all, namely the second coming of Jesus Christ. It's the same kind of language used in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, and in the book of Revelation, various descriptions of the second coming. So when Christ comes again, that cosmic language may be metaphorical because it's the typical language used by the prophets. However, as D.A. Carson points out, the signs that accompany the second coming are probably meant to be taken literally because of the climactic nature of the Son of Man's final disclosure. Because one of the things that his second coming will bring about will be the destruction or cleansing and renewal of the earth. And I think that is going to be literal. So it's, again, we have seen earlier in this book that Habakkuk's description has eschatological overtones, or is pointing forward to the eschaton when Christ comes again. We've seen in chapter 2, verse 14, that the whole earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. That comes through Jesus. And now again, he's using typical prophetic language of important political crises and regime changes. But again, his language is broad enough and is similar enough to point forward to the second coming of Christ. Now, this language that he's using throughout chapter 3 also relates back to Habakkuk's first complaint in chapter 1, because both chapter 1 and chapter 3, they're highly militaristic in their descriptions. They use the same kind of words to describe the advance both of the Babylonian army and then of God himself. The words like come, march, horses, the Babylonians devouring their enemies. Again, these words are repeated. And so we saw how God repeated the same kind of language in a couple of places to refer, to tell Habakkuk, I have heard you. And now this same kind of language is being used to refer back, to relate to the Babylonians, as described in God's first answer in verses 5 through 11 in chapter 1, and now this final theophany. But again, look at the contrast. The Babylonian armies were described first in chapter 1, and they are indeed powerful, and they wrought great destruction. But compare that now with how God is described. He is infinitely greater. He has the entire world as his scope. And so it is cosmic destruction that is being described here in chapter 3. And so the description of Yahweh's approach is twice as long as the description of the approaching Babylonian army. And his God's power affects the entire heavens and the earth, the mountains, the seas, and all the nations. and the forces of Babylon. And we'll see at the end of chapter 3, this is important because Habakkuk is able to rest in the Lord, knowing that he is sovereign, has all power, including over the Babylonians who are coming to invade. Now, this section, verses 3 through 15, is structurally in two parts. First, verses 3 through 7, and then verses 8 through 15. Now, verses 3 through 7 are framed by the only geographical references. In verse 3, where it says, God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran, and in verse 7, I saw the tents of Cushan and the curtains of the land of Midian trembling. In the first section here, God is not addressed directly, but in verses 8 through 15, that section includes, or subsection includes, no specific geographical references, but do include images of water, rivers, the sea, raging waters, the deep, and military images, which were not present in verses 3 through 7. Also, in the subsection 8 through 15, God is addressed directly as you. Now, I've already mentioned that the imagery of Habakkuk is derived primarily from God's powerful work at the time of the Exodus and Mount Sinai. And so he's looking back, and that's why he could pray in verse 2 that God would revive his work because of the Exodus and at Mount Sinai, revive his work where he in fact did save his people from slavery in Egypt. Now, the reference in verse 3 to God coming from Mount Teman and Mount Paran clearly alludes to Deuteronomy 33, verse 2, which was the blessing of Moses just before Israel entered the land, where he said, the Lord came from Sinai and dawned on them from Seir. He shone forth from Mount Paran, and he came from the midst of 10,000 holy ones. At his right hand there was flashing lightning for them. Now, Teman was located in Edom, also known as Seir, which is south and west of the Dead Sea. Paran refers to the main desert in eastern Sinai. Some scholars view Mount Paran as the same as Mount Sinai, while others look for a separate Mount Paran. But again, those references are clearly alluding back to the time of the Exodus and Mount Sinai. And when it says also that in verse 3 that God's splendor covered the heavens and the earth was full of his praise, that is harking back to chapter 2, verse 14, where he says that the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of God. Now, I should point out, throughout chapter 3, the past tense is used. This has also been called the prophetic perfect. In Hebrew and Aramaic idiom, something that was written that is absolutely positively going to happen in the future is often spoken of as having occurred already in the past. And in the book, I give a number of examples from Genesis, from Job, and from Isaiah. Now, many translations will translate the verbs in Habakkuk chapter 3 in the future tense, but in Hebrew, they are in the past or perfect tense. This, again, known as the prophetic perfect. Now, this prayer represents Habakkuk's changed perspective of things. And remember, he has had now this theophonic vision. His eyes have been opened to God's presence and power. Look at the difference. In chapters 1 and 2, the emphasis was on the human agents whom God is using to work out his plan. And Habakkuk's, the whole issue was the particular circumstances that was facing Judah. In chapter 3, the emphasis is on God himself. And so in God's answer to Habakkuk, particularly in chapter 2, verses 5 through 19, he assured him that Babylon was going to be judged. But we saw that God's perspective extended far beyond that and was universal and eschatological. Now here in chapter 3, Habakkuk himself has a universal and eschatological perspective. And so in chapter 3, verses 6 and 7, actually the whole chapter makes clear that God's judgment is not against only one nation, either Egypt at the time of the Exodus, or Judah, or Babylon now, but it is against the entire earth. Verses 6 and 7. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. Now, it's very interesting that same kind of language is used in the book of Revelation to talk about the eschatological second coming of Christ, which brings with it judgment, destruction, and renewal of the earth. And so Revelation 6, verse 14, every mountain and island were moved out of their places. Revelation 16, verse 20, every island fled away and the mountains were not found. Revelation 20, verse 11, earth and heaven fled away and no place was found for them. So again, the language of this vision of God is universal and really is eschatological. Now, in verse 8, it's the third instance of Habakkuk questioning God. The first one, how long, O Lord, shall I cry out and you won't hear? The second one, aren't you from everlasting, O Lord my God? So how can you let the Babylonians, who are worse than us, judge us? Well, now in chapter 3, verse 8, his question is of a different kind. He asks, was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers, or your indignation against the sea, when you rode on your horses, on your chariot of salvation? Essentially, he's asking, what's the purpose of all of this? And the answer is hinted at by reference to your chariot of salvation. You went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. I'm reading now from verse 13. That's where the answer is found. You went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. So again, we've seen God's twin purposes are salvation of his people and judgment on the unrighteous. We saw that in chapter 2, where verse 14, where the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of God. But in verses 18 and 19 of chapter 2, he attacked the idolatry of the nations. Well, now Habakkuk is asking, why were you doing this? He hints at it, talking about the chariot of salvation. Then verse 13 gives the answer. You went out for the salvation of your people, and you crushed the head of the wicked. Salvation and judgment. Salvation of his people and judgment on the wicked. God's twin purposes, sort of two sides of the same coin. Now that is a good place to stop here in this lecture. In the next lecture, we will complete Habakkuk 3 as we look at God's universal plan of judgment and salvation, as well as the last 3 verses where we see Habakkuk's new focus and our situation compared to that of Habakkuk.